Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Peace Accords Matrix Policy Briefs. My name is Josefina Chavarria, and I am the director of the Peace Accords Matrix and associate professor of the practice at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Today, we are launching the first collection of PAM policy briefs. The briefs provide accessible material to inform practitioners, decision makers, and peacemakers about best practices for negotiation, design, and implementation of intrastate peace accords. The first collection consists of 6 briefs authored by PhD students, young scholars, faculty, and researchers at the University of Notre Dame. The research underlying the briefs is based on the PAM data or other field research performed by our team at the Kroc Institute. Readers will find briefs that address issues related to both content and process, which are of key importance for successful peace accord design and implementation. Today, we have with us the series authors who will present some of their key findings, but we invite you all to read the complete briefs online on our website under the new heading Policy. With us today, we have Sally Sharif, postdoctoral researcher at the Kroc Institute, who also has helped me in compiling and editing the series, and to whom I am deeply grateful for making this series possible. We also have Jason Quinn, associate research professor at the Kroc Institute. He's going to turn on his camera. Elise Dita, who is a research associate at the Peace Accords Matrix. Madhav Joshi, who is a co-director of PAM and research professor at the Kroc Institute and the associate director. Ana Sanchez is also joining us, who is a PhD candidate in peace studies and history at the University of Notre Dame. Also on the panel is Maria Jose Daza, who is a recent graduate of the Masters in Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. And last but not least, we have Isabel Guisa Gomez, who is a PhD student in the Joint Peace Studies and Political Science program at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to all of our authors, and thank you for joining us in this panel presentation today. Together with all these authors, we will present the main insights on implementation roadmaps, reincorporation of former combatants, partial peace agreements, and citizens' perceptions of implementation, among others. After the authors' presentations, we will have time for questions and answers. So please do not hesitate to include your questions in the Q&A chat in our Zoom webinar here under this icon chat. Let's now turn to the authors. I'll ask a few questions and you will have circa 3 minutes to respond to each of them. So Jason, good afternoon. You are our first speaker. And your brief with Sally Sharif discusses violence recurrence after signing peace agreements. Do you care to share with us what are your main findings, please? Maybe, do you want to turn on the mic? Thank you.
Got it. Rookie mistake. Okay, thanks, Josefina. What this brief does is summarizes 10 case studies that were written where the signatories to comprehensive peace agreements started to fight again at some time after the signing. And then some lessons and patterns that came out of those 10 case studies. So there's been dozens and dozens of empirical studies on recurrence, in the last few decades. And but they don't answer the kind of basic everyday questions that you might have about groups fighting, like how common is it among all the cases, who started the fight, who threw the first punch, when did it happen, was it real fast, immediate, or did it build over time, things like that. And then also what was related to that last question is what was the cause? I mean, what were the players saying before it happened, if you can discern that? I don't think the empirical studies do a good job of putting that out there in a simple, kind of straightforward language. So if you want to look at, so we can look at the first one here. So how common is recurrence between the signatories to a comprehensive peace agreement? It's actually pretty rare. Only in 30% of the cases did the parties fight each other, and that's using a very low threshold of 25 battle deaths. On the second question of who started it, in governmental conflicts where the goal was to take over the control of the central government, it was usually a government faction that threw the first punch, and that was not representative of the government army as a whole. In territorial conflicts, it was usually a faction of the rebel side, which also didn't represent the rebel group as a whole. 3 is for when did it tend to happen. Almost all the recurrences happened in the first year. In the governmental conflicts, they almost all were in the first year, and many immediately and in the first few months. Now, in territorial conflicts, most happened after the 5th year. So big difference there based on conflict type. Lastly, on what was the cause, there was several that didn't seem to have a cause. Now that's interesting because, and in those instances, the fighting just seemed to continue through the signing of the peace agreement. In other words, I mean, it just seems like there were factions out in the field that didn't know or didn't care that an accord was even signed, right? So if you look at those negotiations, they were usually very short. So that was kind of one clear pattern. Now in those cases where the recurrence came later and had more of a definable or observable cause, it was almost always one side attacking the other with accusations that they weren't fulfilling their implementation commitments.
Wow, I think you're already partially responding to my next question, which is, how are the findings that you've created and elaborated based on the research for this brief? How are they known? How do they kind of like challenge what we already know about peace agreements?
I think there's several new findings here. I mean, at least I haven't really heard these said, but I'll focus on 2 that go against the conventional wisdom the most, I think. Well, first of all, I mean, I've heard it said, you know, online and in speeches and in papers, and especially in foreign policy circles, but also in papers, you know, it's repeated all the time that more than half of peace agreements fail. So more than half, I don't know what that would be, that just say 55%, 60%, something like that, right? But in this research, I found that it's half that amount, right? So the failure rate is actually half of what is commonly assumed by people or understood by people. And even in that 30%, most were immediate minor recurrences that were resolved relatively quickly. So if we started looking at recurrence, not in the first year, but maybe in the second year and allow a little bit of a cooling off period, that would be cut in half even again to a 15% or something like that failure rate. So the second question that I think goes against conventional wisdom the most is that when I read through the spoiler literature and the recurrence studies, there seems to be kind of an implicit bias or almost a statist bias or pro-government bias, you know, that even if it's not stated, the way the theory is set up and the way the language used is usually it's assumed that the rebel group is responsible for most of the recurrences. I found that just as a simple arithmetic numerical matter, I mean, most of the recurrences, the government was the first one to attack. It was in over half of the cases. Now in the governmental conflicts, it was a sizable majority, and it was a faction of the government, not necessarily the whole government army. So now, of course, you know, they spun it that, you know, that the rebel group, you know, made them do it, right? But they did. But it was the at least for the first one to engage in the attack, I found that it was usually the government side.
Thank you. Wow, that's really incredible to hear, and I'm very happy to have this brief that is so, you know, as you say, challenges so much of our so-called common wisdom about it. I would like to turn now to our second brief presentation with Elise Dita. Elise, you have a brief with Yvonne Zuniga and Patrick McQuestion, and it's very concrete and discusses how ideas negotiated in a peace agreement should turn into public policy. What are some of your main findings about peace agreement implementation?
Thanks, Josefina. It may be obvious, but I think it bears repeating that our first finding is that it's very difficult to translate or transform peace agreements into public policy for many reasons. One big reason is that often peace agreements are aspirational and perhaps not so specific on what public policies should look like. In addition, often the negotiators of peace agreements are not policymakers specifically. So there may be some disconnect between the language or the goals that they use and the actual creation of public policy. That said, in our survey of the comprehensive peace agreements included in the Peace Accords Matrix, we found 4 or 5 different mechanisms for translating peace agreements into public policy. Each kind of have their own strengths and challenges. So first, many peace agreements are kind of entered into the national legal ecosystem through either international treaties or resolutions or constitutional amendments, which is often, not that it's easy, but it's often more of a formal or protocol process that can occur at the beginning of implementation. In addition, another process that often happens at the beginning of implementation is that the accord itself includes a detailed implementation timeline. So of the 34 comprehensive peace agreements in the Peace Accords Matrix database, 24 have detailed implementation timelines. These are usually used for things related to demobilization, disarmament and reintegration, and sometimes issues related to the political participation of the signatories of the accord. Another common way that peace agreements are translated into public policy is through the passage of peace-related legislation. In many cases, that is legislation related to war tribunals, truth and reconciliation commissions, but it also sometimes has to do with media reform, elections, and education. Of course, the challenge of peace-related legislation is that it is subject to political tensions if the agreement is passed in a parliamentarian or congressional kind of way. Another common way that the peace agreements are transformed into public policy is through the institutional reform or establishment. So we can think about, for example, the CPA in Nepal or Guatemala, where the government's created new ministries or departments to oversee implementation. Similar to peace-related legislation, this requires political buy-in. Also, there can be challenges with the overlap of new infrastructure, new peace infrastructure and existing government infrastructure that can create challenges and lack of buy-in. And third, the power and the mandate that this institution is given really affects how effective it is. And finally, there's just a lot of technical steps that need to be taken for this to happen. So staffing, funding, creation of mandates, things like that, that can be complicated and take a little bit longer. And then finally, the last process that we often see is the creation of specific peace policy programs. So those take commitments in the accord and kind of carry them out in planning documents, creating indicators, responsible parties, etc. That again it can be very challenging. It can be subject to political maneuvering, and it can be very difficult to take those general commitments in the accord and create specific indicators. So often peace agreements will include more than one of these options for translating peace agreements into public policy.
Thank you. That's really very informative to hear all these different ways in which public policy can really take on the implementation of peace agreements. And your brief focuses very much on Colombia. And I was wondering, if we look at the Colombian case, what are the lessons that we can learn for precisely doing this somewhere else?
Yeah, so like you said, we focused particularly on the case of Colombia and the transferring or translation of the 2016 peace agreement into public policy in the country of Colombia. Colombia included all of those mechanisms that I just mentioned, but one that was particularly salient was the creation of a peace policy document called the Framework Implementation Plan, which included more than 500 indicators regarding implementation of text of the peace agreement. So other cases have had something like this. The case of El Salvador is a good example, but the Colombian case is perhaps innovative in a number of ways. First, it was so comprehensive. It involved all 6 points of the accord. It involved, I think, more than 40 institutions responsible for all those indicators. And also the creation of the indicators was somewhat of a participatory process, bringing together members of the FARC, the government, ethnic groups, and groups that focus on gender inclusion. So yeah, in a lot of ways it was innovative and a really important document. That said, it also had challenges that can be lessons learned for other processes. The first challenge that I kind of alluded to is still 5 years into implementation, some of the indicators in the Framework Implementation Plan are not considered technically viable. So that means we don't know exactly what we're measuring in those indicators. So I think that shows two disconnects. First, there's a disconnect that I already talked about between the aspirational language of the accord and the actual creation of public policy. And then also, as I said, the creation of these indicators was a participatory process, but often rebel groups, and in this case, other civil society groups, don't have perhaps training in public policy language, in the creation of indicators and timelines and things like that. So it was often a very difficult process to come to agreement on these indicators. And then a second challenge that we're seeing is in Colombia's case, there was already a robust infrastructure for public policy planning and implementation. And there have been challenges with integrating this new public policy with other public policies, especially at the local level. And that is partly because a law on public policy planning was never reformed in order to integrate this new framework plan into it. So there's some legislative gaps in the implementation of the Framework Implementation Plan as well.
Thank you very much, Elise. I think we're going to continue learning a lot about this, the experience in Colombia. I don't think we have also ever had such a great level of detail about an implementation plan, and I'm very happy for your work, and thank you for sharing that. We are going to continue with the case of Colombia. And for that, discussing our next brief, I want to invite Ana Mercedes Sanchez to tell us more about her brief with Madhav Joshi, which talks about partial peace agreements. Ana, what are the main differences between comprehensive and partial accords?
Thank you, Professor Chavarria, and greetings, everyone. So the Peace Accords Matrix defines comprehensive peace agreements as those who include the major warring parties and address the substantive issues underlying the conflict. And so these are agreements that are usually intended as the final agreement between the parties and expected to terminate the conflict. Conversely, in this brief with Dr. Joshi, we have defined partial peace agreements, or PPAs, as agreements that either exclude some of the major parties or only partially address the underlying causes of the conflict. And PPAs can also be agreements that do not address issues of the conflict whatsoever, but instead outline future negotiations. This is important because while comprehensive peace agreements are the desired outcome of a peace negotiation process, we know from the existing evidence that partial peace agreements are far more common than comprehensive ones. So in this brief, we look at 36 partial peace agreements signed in Colombia from 1984 to 2012, and we use PAM's methodology to look at the implementation of these agreements provisions or commitments between the parties in a 10-year period. And asking ourselves, like, what can we learn from these robust peacemaking experience in Colombia?
Thank you, Anna. What a great insight that can be also for negotiators who are in the process of, designing these partial peace agreements to know what are the best chances that they might have of actually getting to a comprehensive one. So precisely that would be my next question. What are the main contributions that your brief makes to peace agreement design or implementation?
Thank you. So we make one recommendation in regards to design, and that is that negotiators of partial peace agreements should focus on provisions that can foster trust between the parties, and therefore encouraging future negotiations to hopefully arrive to a comprehensive peace agreement. So one specific recommendation that we make is that partial peace agreements should include detailed security provisions that can anticipate post-accord security threats to demobilize groups, and as a central part of that trust building process. And in addition to that, PPAs should outline future negotiations to address the issues of the conflict that the parties have yet to deal with. In terms of implementation, the main recommendation is that the states should pay equal attention to all of the provisions in the agreement. Instead of overemphasizing certain provisions such as disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration measures, the recommendation is that, especially for partial peace agreements, the implementation of political and economic reforms that are outlined in the agreement are fully implemented. And this integral implementation can in turn foster better trust between the signatory parties, and also encourage non-signatory parties to enter into the peace negotiation process, which is very relevant for contexts with multiple armed groups.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much for your work. And now I would like to turn to our next brief with Maria Jose Daza. I can see her here. Maria Jose, I was wondering, in your brief, you're emphasizing the importance of people's perceptions of peace agreement implementation. And even though it might sound a little bit obvious, why don't you elaborate a little bit for our audience of why are those perceptions important in the implementation phase?
Thank you, Josefina, for the question. So I would just take a little step back on why did I ended up asking about this, and is that I was working in Colombia with the implementation of the peace agreement, and I think that was pushing in my mind and very concerning is that I had meetings mainly with the international community where they were praising like how good the implementation was going, that there were all those reports saying that implementation had been progressing, but at the same time, when I went to certain territories of the country, especially those that had been more affected by conflict, people's perception of the implementation did not match those expectations that I heard at the capital city. They were not satisfied with the implementation of the peace agreement. So I started to wonder like what could be the reason behind the difference between like measuring the implementation rate and the perception people had on the implementation of a peace agreement. And then when looking at that, what I realized or what I had to look is what were people's understandings of peace versus the more traditional academic understanding of peace in academia. So usually like a successful peace agreement is defined as one that managed to end the armed confrontations between the signatory parties, usually for a period at least of 5 years. But then when you talk to people and ask them what does peace mean to them, the security component it's central, like this absence of armed conflict is central, but it's not the unique factor that affects their perception of the peace agreement. There are measures of well-being. And in the case of Colombia, the agreement itself talks about improving the well-being and addressing the underlying causes of the conflict, but as a goal of the agreement. So for me, from that statement and from that aim of the agreement, it followed that people's experiences and perception of well-being are a constitutive part of the agreement's definition of peace, at least in the case of Colombia. And second, that the attainment of such well-being should be taken into consideration when evaluating the success of the peace agreement. So I think that's part of what I believe perception, and I argue perception, it's important, because if you are trying to address the root causes of conflict, a lot of which deal with people's or affect directly people's well-being, then their own their assessment of their well-being should be central to measuring the successful implementation of an agreement.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So what if I was an implementing agency, let's say, trying to learn from your brief, not only in Colombia, but in other parts of the world? What are the main takeaways for me as an implementation agency from your research?
I would say there would be like three main takeaways, one specifically for implementation agencies, and is that having like these different measures of implementation and perception allows you to have a more comprehensive system for follow-up that can offer different, but at the same time complementary sources for analysis of peace agreement implementation. So it's not arguing that let's not focus on like the timely adoption of certain measures, or just let's not measure at all with indicators what the agreement, how the agreement is being implemented. No, what I'm arguing is that those more like objective measures should be complemented with other measures that allow you to understand people's perceptions, so that you can have a more like a well-rounded analysis, not only of the timely implementation of the agreement, but the impact that it's having in people's lives. I would also say that for governments in general, this measuring perception sheds some light on people's needs and their understanding of peace, which in turn can serve to assist in the prioritization and implementation roadmaps of the peace agreement. As Elise was mentioning before, translating a peace agreement into policy, it's difficult, to say the least. And here, like, just having these tools can give you some light to what are the areas that people value and are a priority for them. And lastly, I would argue, and this is more like from an academic standpoint, is how do we conceive of success when measuring the implementation of a peace agreement? Should we stick to the definition of just ending the armed confrontation between the parties, or maybe should we consider having a more wide definition that involves also the extent to which the agreement managed to address those root causes of the conflict?
Thank you. That is really interesting and quite important for implementation agencies, but all of us who are actually not only concerned about the implementation process, but overall peace building strategies in the mid and in the long term. So thank you very much. And I would like now for us to take a deeper look at the relationship between the design of the text and international relations. Isabel, your brief with Jason Quinn and myself argues for including international humanitarian law in designing and implementing the peace agreement. Tell us a little bit, how does that work in practice?
Thank you, Josefina, for your question. Yes, indeed, our policy brief focuses on the role that international humanitarian law has played in peace negotiation, designing, and implementation. And before starting to lay out our findings, I would like to define what we mean by international humanitarian law. It is a set of rules intended to limit the atrocious effects of armed confrontation in both international and non-international armed conflicts. And more specifically, IHL protects non-combatant populations and regulates methods of warfare. And in our brief, we highlight different ways that IHL has informed different stages in peace processes. And for now, I would like to highlight two of them. You can find out more about them in our policy brief. First, during peace negotiations, observing IHL can help lessen mistrust among signatories and strengthen the commitment to achieving peace. And the 1992 San Jose Agreement on Human Rights that was signed between the Salvadorian government and the FMLN is a good example in this point. This agreement not only established guiding disposition for the parties to successfully achieve a comprehensive peace agreement, but it also commissions the United Nations to monitor compliance with commitments on human rights and IHL issues, such as return measures for displaced persons and refugees. And this strategy and measure was critical for the parties to keep negotiations alive amidst armed confrontation and foster trustworthiness among them while they were handling with peace negotiations. And a second finding is regarding designing peace agreements. IHL can be used as a sort of template for defining violent acts committed by perpetrators. And here, Colombia is a good case in point. Drawing on existing precedents, increasing enforcement of IHL, the 2011 Victims and Land Restitution Law established that all sides to the conflict should abide by the terms of IHL. And that was critical for future peace negotiations because this was the first time that the Colombian state expressly recognized that the country was undergoing an armed conflict or a civil war. And furthermore, IHL was used as a yardstick to define the lawfulness and unlawfulness of atrocities and crimes committed during the war. So particularly IHL was used by both the government and the FARC-EP to define which atrocities ought to be addressed through criminal accountability and which crimes could be pardoned via amnesties in the sake of peace negotiations.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for your input. So if you were going to kind of like list this in a very straightforward way, what are the main benefits already of including IHL in future agreements, and what could be the challenges for negotiators?
Yeah, I have already sort of highlighted two bright benefits from using IHL in peace negotiation design and implementation. So for now, I'd like to stress one important challenge coming from this practice. And that relates to time frame implementation of IHL and also its vanishing point. Because conventionally, IHL is restricted to wartime. It is intended to regulate warfare during armed confrontation. It means that IHL comes into force when armed confrontation begins, and it ceases to apply when armed confrontation ends. And however, we have seen that provisions on IHL have been common in peace agreements. That means at the end, at the demise of armed confrontation. For instance, the 61 peace agreements signed between 2000 and 2019 to end intrastate wars collectively contained 399 paragraphs with IHL provisions. And it raises several questions on its vanishing point and implementation timeframe. For instance, when does IHL cease to apply after the signing of a peace agreement when armed groups have laid down weapons and armed confrontation ended, if IHL was intended to regulate armed confrontation while it was happening? What is the implementation timeframe for IHL provisions? And when do IHL stipulations become human rights reforms outside of war? So we no longer say that we are handling with IHL provisions. Another challenge I would like to highlight is the signing of a comprehensive peace agreement as a special humanitarian agreement under Common Article 3. And there are some cases, for instance, the 1993 Liberian Peace Agreement and the 2016 Colombian Peace Agreement. And it has been used as a strategy to foster compliance among the signatories. But we don't really know what sort of effects signing a comprehensive peace agreement as a special humanitarian agreement have on peace implementation. So should a comprehensive peace agreement be regarded as a special humanitarian agreement, even if it includes commitments beyond the scope of international humanitarian law? For instance, political participation, integrated rural reform, or measures on illicit crops. Also, if a party to the agreement breaches non-international humanitarian dispositions, should be held accountable through IHL monitoring mechanisms, even though those dispositions weren't strictly related to IHL. So these are the sort of challenges that we need to handle with when we are using IHL in peace processes.
Thank you so much. You're already advancing a little bit our last round of questions, but before we get there, I want to turn to my co-editor, Sally Sharif. Sally, your brief talks about a specific issue, which is reincorporation of ex-combatants during the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process. the so-called DDR process. Are there any novel findings that diverge from what we already know about these DDR processes?
Thank you, Josefina, and greetings to everyone. Reintegration programs have primarily focused on the economic aspects of return to society for individual ex-combatants. And they're funded usually by international organizations such as the World Bank as part of a country's post-conflict economic recovery. Now, despite recent calls to take into account the needs of ex-combatants and civilian communities, the cantonment part of DDR often follows these generic guidelines that have little consideration for former rebel communities and the ex-combatants' preference for maintaining these communities. So cantonment is meant to prepare individual ex-combatants for life after conflict within a community of civilians and not ex-combatants. It involves breaking the command and control structure of an armed group and disbanding wartime ties, while ex-combatants are given economic support and psychosocial support to function on their own outside the group. Now, while governments and international organizations might prefer this cantonment procedure, it might not be the rebels' preferred method of approaching DDR. And my research also finds it to be the other way around. The peace process with the FARC and the treatment of ex-combatants, which I discuss in this brief, presents fundamental differences with other DDR programs, even implemented in Colombia with individual FARC members that had defected from the FARC or the Colombian paramilitaries. The FARC insisted on a collective and participatory approach to reintegration. So instead of the government managing individual ex-combatants, the FARC preferred a collective approach that was based on economic, political, and social solidarity. So it didn't so much focus on reintegrating ex-combatants into the labor market, but stipulated measures for a long-term encampment period with collective economic projects. Now, there were 24 cantons that were built as part of the peace process. And these cantons aspired to retain ex-combatants within the DDR program, so retain them within these cantons and create economic opportunities for them within the cantons. What I found was that unlike the common wisdom, the more cohesive the ex-combatant units were in the canton, the more successful these cantons were in building collective economic projects and then keeping ex-combatants together within the DDR process. So the novel finding that the brief discusses is that maintaining the wartime command and control structure of cohesive rebel groups like the FARC not only does not jeopardize peace, but also helps with ex-combatant demobilization and reintegration in the immediate aftermath of a civil war.
Wow, thank you. That's a real novel finding. And you know, we say in peace studies, even if we do a lot of comparative work, that there is no solution that fits all, right? But we can still learn better practices or best practices in order to inform those that are confronted with dilemmas or paradoxes and want to have like a good example to learn from and just draw inspiration and creativity, which is so important for conflict transformation. So even though the FARC is a very special case, what do you think, or how do you think that these findings might apply to other DDR provisions in other peace agreements?
That's a great question. And you're right, we must be very careful when we compare cases that might not have to do a lot with each other, where the cultural context could be different or other socio-political factors could be in play. So, so selecting cases to see how far these findings travel will be crucial. There are two contemporary DDR programs, if you want to look back to compare this case with, that most resemble the case study. And these are the 1992 to 93 program with the FMLN in El Salvador and the 2007 to 2013 program with the Communist Party of Nepal. Now, these are similar to the DDR program with the FARC because number one, they all followed a long civil conflict with an integrated leftist rebel group. And all three included a long demobilization and reintegration program in camps or cantons. And they also included peace agreements that allowed rebels rebels to form a political party. So future research could study how the command and control structure of the rebel group affected its combatant demobilization and reintegration in Nepal and El Salvador. Now, for future cases, which we're interested in, and I believe that a lot of DDR cases in the future will be looking at the case of the FARC in Colombia for designing their DDR programs. My theory applies best to cases of DDR where the rebel group has a clear organizational structure, what we in political science call primary and secondary group cohesion. So where wartime ties are strong, so that these strong wartime bonds can be used for the purpose of peace during the implementation phase of DDR provisions of a peace agreement. However, what follows from this brief and my research is that even in designing DDR with less cohesive groups, we should pay attention to combatants' preferences for maintaining their wartime communities, because it's not very easy to reintegrate into a community of civilians after war. And we should also take advantage of these social bonds for the purpose of peace.
Thank you very much, Sally. I'm very happy that we've had the opportunity to go over these briefs individually. And now what I would like us to do is to maybe have some sort of collective discussion and highlighting both what are the main findings for our policy work, but also what are the main findings for our scholarly work, which we're always trying to intersect in the most fruitful way. So I wanted to ask a round of questions to Jason, Madhav, and Isabel. And for you to please let me know what are some of the new paths for research that your briefs disclose, either to you or to others who would like to further investigate this topic. So I would like to ask if we can go in the order of Jason, Madhav, and Isabel, just with a couple of minutes each. Thank you. Jason, I think you still have the mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I've got it.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was clicking on it, but it wasn't working. So future research that may come out of this. I mean, I discussed the overall form of the research, and the main questions that I was attempting to answer. But so I guess you would have to look at some of that at what I found. First of all, I mean that recurrences are far less common than what we may think, right? So we have to really examine that and say, where this assumption that more than half of all peace agreements fail, we really need to track that down better and find out how that originated. I mean, I would imagine it's, just from looking into it briefly myself, I know that it's essentially a philosophy of science issue. I mean, the earliest samples that came out were really small kind of samples. Over the last 30 years, the samples got bigger and bigger and bigger, but some of those early findings that were conducted on very small groups stuck. And also there's a lot of conflation there. It is true that half of all civil wars are followed by more civil wars, but that doesn't have anything to do with peace agreements. That's only that one civil war is more like a country that has one civil war is more likely to have another. And over half of civil wars may be followed by another, but it has nothing to do with the way that the war ends. And civil wars can end in a lot of different ways. Let's look at another finding that the recurrence times were very different. When you look at governmental conflicts versus territorial conflicts, I mean, I may have missed it, but I really haven't encountered that before. So that's definitely something that I think deserves a lot more attention, right? Why would recurrence show a fundamentally completely different pattern based on conflict type, right? So we don't have time to get into it here, but I mean, we'd have to flesh out the policy recommendations or ramifications of that. I mean, what it would suggest just immediately is that depending on conflict type, I mean, just one peace agreements, one piece, one form doesn't fit all. So you would really need a different type of agreement for each of those, really for different, I guess I can put it more precisely. I think that you need a different type of agreement for territorial conflicts that involve high levels of decentralization and autonomy, because I think that those goals are fundamentally different than the other commitments that are usually in peace agreements. In other words, to put it a slightly different way, governments really, really don't like to implement decentralization and autonomy provisions, right? So in a territorial conflict, that's all you're going to have in the entire agreement. That's why you get such low levels of implementation. So you're going to need a much more robust monitoring and verification structure there.
Thank you, Jason. Madhav, may I ask you if, now that you've been waiting all this time, silently, to help us also find or shed some light on what are the potential new scholarly venues for the type of research that your brief uncovers with Ana Sanchez.
Thank you, Josefina, and good afternoon all. I would like to suggest several topics to advance, this line of research, meaning the partial peace accords. First area is about pathways to peace agreement. I would say that the partial peace agreements is perhaps the least explored topic in peace research. We focus, on final or comprehensive peace agreement in peace accords matrix, but the pathways to peace, to final agreement or comprehensive one in most cases is always through the partial peace agreement. But how it is designed in a broader negotiation process and how the partial peace agreement is sustained throughout the negotiation process is perhaps the least explored research topic. And this is one great area of research. The another one is the phrase I use is devil is in the details. So the parcels are different as these agreements deal with one or few topics at a time, right? Perhaps there might be some empirical pattern going on. Maybe the negotiating parties are dealing with easy cases, early in the negotiation process and saving the hard ones for the next round of negotiation. We really don't know about that. So, and also, because of this, it also suggests maybe specific types of actors are involved in a specific phase during the negotiation process. So this is, another great area of research for the future. And the third one is, when we research about peace agreement, then the focus should be at the system or the historic approach when possible. The reason why I say this is because, when we study all the parcels in a given process, just a step back, like the research that we did in the parcels in Colombia, going back all the way to 1984. So it allows, one to understand what changed, what changed in terms of the strategies of the parties, what changed in terms of the content of the negotiation itself. For example, there is perhaps a reason why the 2016 Colombian final agreement is so detailed oriented, because in the past you do not encounter that much of lengthy discussion about specific reforms and that level of clarity. And then also again in case of Colombia, the multi-party negotiation, of course, there are a lot of groups fighting, but multi-party negotiation is not a common practice. And the reason is because when they were in late 1980s and early 1990, the multi-party negotiation process did not work. So it failed, and that's why they are not replicating that experience again here. With that, I stop here and happy to answer any specific questions going forward.
Thank you, Madhav. Yes, we're going to have at the end, we're going to look into more questions that have been pre-submitted and that people are sharing also with us here in the Q&A. But I would like to ask Isabel also for these new venues for scholarly work, whether for yourself or for others that, that your brief helps us kind of like at least point towards.
Thank you, Josefina. Yes, there are at least 2 venues for future research. First, IHL compliance in peace implementation merits further attention. We don't know yet which concrete consequence non-compliant signatories face before the international community when fail to fulfill the terms of the agreement. And this was a heated debate in Colombia a couple of years ago, when former FARC commanders argued that grave breaches to the peace accord by the Colombian state, like violence against ex-combatants or unilateral changes to the terms of the agreement via lawmaking and policymaking, must be considered as perfidy. And perfidy is a sort of international crime that happens when one side to the agreement deceives the other side. So for instance, the parties signed up a ceasefire or an amnesty, and then the other party inflicted any sort of personal and physical injury on the other side after surrendering weapons. And this highlights many questions, legal questions on IHL implementation and compliance, because for a Colombian case, particularly, for instance, if we were to agree that violence against combatants and unilateral changes to the terms of the agreement should be considered as breaches to the accord itself, perfidy doesn't fit neatly into this case. So we need to find other ways to see what sort of consequences a non-compliant party should face before the international community in order to do and reinforce IHL in peace implementation. And a second venue for future research would be to understand the sign of peace agreements, comprehensive peace agreements, as humanitarian agreements under Common Article 3. We don't know if parties and warring parties resort to this strategy just to signal their intention to provide compliance guarantees, but at the end, the sign of the agreement under this international figure doesn't have any concrete effects during peace implementation. So there are a couple of examples that I already highlighted, for instance, the 1993 Liberian Agreement and the Colombian Agreement, but before and beyond the intention that the parties showed when they're signing a peace agreement, we don't know what sort of concrete effects signing the agreements and their special humanitarian agreement could have in international humanitarian law or before the international community broadly.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you so much. You know, at the Peace Accords Matrix, we're constantly trying to bridge or bring together research and policy practice and seeking, of course, to have a positive impact that enhances the success of peace agreements from their negotiation and planning all the way through their implementation. So I would like to turn to our other 3 speakers and presenters and focus even more on the question of practice. And I would like to ask Maria Jose, Elise, and Sally, which are the main policy recommendations that your work has brought to light? Starting with Maria Jose.
Thank you, Josefina. As I spoke before, I think like policy recommendations, specifically from my research, like to the government or implementing agencies, had a lot to do like with prioritization and understanding better like people's own understandings of peace. So I didn't mention this before, and I'm just going to do it briefly. During my research, and I based on a survey made by UNDP and PRIO, and they found that people who were overall more saw progress and health and education services were overall more satisfied with the implementation of the peace agreement. So although security remains central, there's other aspects that are more related with the provision of basic services that allow for just having a good quality of life and social mobility are central for their notions of peace. So this could give the government some lights of where to prioritize certain efforts. It's not to say that you have to dismiss other parts of the agreement, but just to acknowledge that people has certain needs that have not been met, that somehow are underlying the reasons of the conflict, and that as a government or as an implemented agency, there's tools that you have to guide you on how to prioritize the implementation process.
Thank you very much. Elise, the same question to you. Which are the main policy recommendations that your work has brought to light?
Yeah, we focused in our brief on the design of the policy, the public policies and accompanying legislation. So our recommendations are very specific to that. You were asking about further research domains, and I think one is thinking about what recommendations are for the actual implementation of these public policies, particularly related to adjustments for the public policies that are necessary with different contexts and different events that occur in a country post peace agreement. But in terms of the design of these public policies, two related recommendations. First, as I was saying, often the indicators on public policy for peace agreements are unclear and difficult to measure. This is partially because the peace agreement itself can be unclear on what is desired. So one recommendation for future processes is, after the processes have exited any perhaps secret or confidential stage they're in, to include technocrats, people who work in public policy creation, even as just observers in the peace agreement negotiation, so they can kind of understand the spirit of the commitments in the accord and better and start thinking about how they could be created into public policy. At the same time, I mentioned that an innovative part of the Colombian public policy planning process was that it brought in civil society groups to help create the indicators. However, that has its challenges because often these groups aren't trained in creating public policy. So a second recommendation to perhaps international funders or other organizations could be to provide that kind of training to signatories of the agreement, particularly rebel groups, also to civil society groups that may be involved, so that they can have a robust conversation about creation of indicators and public policies. And then finally, it's important to include, perhaps in the peace agreement or shortly after peace agreement, legal mechanisms in order to assure that public policies created under the peace agreement is also linked to other public policy planning processes. This will often occur through legislation, and if that doesn't happen, there's often a gap in that implementation.
Thank you, Elise. If I may turn to Sally once more, and Sally, help us shed light on those policy recommendations that your brief allowed us to see. Thank you.
Sure. Like you said, what I found was that when demobilization and reintegration camps are cohesive and they are led by their wartime commanders, they can succeed economically as a group, even if these cantons are built in regions with very weak institutions or unfavorable economic and political conditions. So what we take away as policy recommendations is that when we are designing demobilization and reintegration programs that involve long cantonment periods, we should look at the wartime command and control structure of the group, and these should be capitalized to maintain the post-conflict group cohesion. Especially former commanders, we call them mid-level commanders or field commanders. They should be given leadership roles for the purpose of peace building, especially in economic reintegration programs for ex-combatants. Another recommendation is that international organizations should help ex-combatants plan collective economic projects, because these economic projects are the ones that work in the long term, and they should provide funding for these projects instead of giving out cash payments to individual ex-combatants or giving economic assistance to individual ex-combatants.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I am really happy to hear so many practical actionable items, so to speak, that decision makers can take away from all your research. Thank you. And thank you all for the presentation of your briefs and this dialogue and this conversation. It has been really eye-opening and highlights the great work that you have all been doing. We have some further questions and answers in the box from our audience, and some of the questions also that those who registered in advance to participate in the seminar have submitted. So I wanted to ask one of those first to Madhav. What, if any, similarities or differences did you identify with regards to local and national peace agreements? For example, more successful implementation at one level or shared prevalence of partial peace agreements?
Thank you, Josefina. So I am reading this question in two different ways. The first is when we talk about the local and national, local and local national and national, right? So the reason why I say this is because there are tendencies in the peace processes to negotiate with the group at the local level. Like there was a lot of at the local level, the commanders negotiating the peace agreement, like for example in Bosnia and Herzegovina when the conflict was going on. And the another one, when I talk about local national, is more like the peace agreement at the level where the conflict issues about territories, like the one in Northern Ireland or in Mindanao or in Bangladesh, right? So there was a kind of like at the local level, but also engaging with the national level government, because they will be the one implementing that one. And national means where the incompatibility is at the government level. So with that, so what I want to see here, what I want to say here is, but I think the question is leaning towards like, when you negotiate the peace agreement, maybe at the national level, you would be able to observe significant progress, but not so much at the local level. I think the question is alluding to that idea. And to some extent, that is observable, immediately after maybe first 5 years of the implementation process, because you would be able to see combatants being demobilized. You would be able to see the post-conflict elections being held. You would be able to see the government making significant progress in terms of institution building, passing laws, international monitors in and out from the country. So you would be able to see, at the national level, a lot is happening. And this also alludes to the brief that Maria was presenting about the public perception, but because at the local level, people are not really seeing any significant activities, maybe around DDR camps, but beyond that, you really don't see. People's livelihood has not changed, right? Not so much. And they, maybe their schools are open, but the kids are still, out of supplies. Teachers are not, they don't have access to healthcare clinic and things like that. But what we have found, in a broader research related to peace accord implementation is, after some time, then the national level priorities shift to the local level. So, and that's why it is important, also to be consciously watching about the implementation of socioeconomic provisions negotiated in the peace accord, which often happens, after at the national level, institution building, legislation and things like that are completed, and at the level, like program implementation level happening at the local level. So if whoever is the one sending this question, if the answer is not satisfactory, we can come back to this one again.
Thank you so much, Madhav. I wonder if I can ask you a follow-up question that also was submitted, because I think you can link your answer to this one too. And is, have you found major differences or similarities regarding the types of peace agreement or their implementation based on the conflict type? Like, is there any relation at all between that?
We have not done, I mean, this can be easily done. I just need to find, where the data is in my in my computer. But obviously, things, so there may be 5 to 10% differences in terms of the implementation in the long run, but we also have to think in terms of how things actually evolve at the implementation level, right? For example, when the conflict is about territory, oftentimes what happens, at the national level policy making process, what happens is that the territory is being granted. Now it is the responsibility, the autonomy is granted. Now it is the responsibility of the entity at the local level to implement the significant reforms, related to specific, autonomy provision. Like, for example, once you secure the autonomy, like, I'm thinking about a case like Northern Ireland and then in Mindanao, now it is the regional level government with responsibility to implement other types of reforms, like socioeconomic reforms, like organizing the DDR process, organizing the truth commission process, and things like that. So, but because these local level entities are out of resources, then there is always back and forth, with the national government and with the international actors who are part of the process. So maybe in the initial phase, you would be able to see significant progress in the implementation for the territorial conflict, but after some time, then maybe they start to slow down. But there is data we can easily. Maybe it's a topic for the next brief, Josefina. So.
Absolutely. We're going to have a second collection hopefully being launched in June. So it's a good question that takes us and invites us to look into this topic further. I have a further question also for Elise, or that I would like to share with Elise. And I think we had it in the chat, so maybe you can just tell us a little bit more so that everyone is aware of it. Could someone summarize briefly the current state of the PAM database? How many agreements and over which years? Thank you.
Yes, so there are 34 cases of comprehensive peace agreements in the Peace Accords matrix. As Anna was saying, a comprehensive peace accord is defined in this case as an accord that includes all of the major conflicting parties and also includes many of the major root causes of the conflict and issues related to the conflict. Right now, those cases cover the years 1989 to 2012. And there's lots of interesting tools you can do on our website looking to compare 51 provisions that are identified in these accords. And we're also working to update the database with more recent cases.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elise. I have another one for Maria Jose. And it also has to do with implementation perception. And the question is, I agree that perception is important to understand how the public and the different agents involved are navigating the path of the peace accords. After 5 years in Colombia, the public judgment matters to advance in all the initiatives. After all the research that has been developed, what do you think should be the path to develop trust in the process, both in the central government and in the local territories? And what role should the media play in this endeavor?
Thank you, Josefina. Well, I would say, first of all, like the agreement itself says that there's a part of implementation that it's directly related with the local governments, with the people. So for like this process to work, there must be trust among both the government and the people, which of course can be threatened if a population or local authorities do not have or have a perception that the agreement is not being implemented the right way. However, I do think there's a way to navigate this, and as I started saying, there's a thing that's perception on like people's own notions of peace. But then this is not to say that there has not been progress in the implementation of the agreement. Kroc and PAM reports are very clear, saying that progress has been made, a lot of progress in certain areas such as DDR, but more structural reforms like the rural reform or the political participation are lagging behind. So this would, of course, take more time, but if you are clear in communicating this, that it's not that we are being successful in implementing the agreement, but we are being successful in implementing certain or specific measures of the agreement, and we still have a lot to do in certain other areas, you can start to create a more clear message of how things are being done. It's not that it's been a failure, it's not that it's a total success, it's that it depends on which measures are you focusing. So I think that's a communication thing that can be better managed both by national and local governments. And in relation to media, I think it also, like having this diverse monitoring mechanism would also be very useful. Because in the case of Colombia, at least when you see a lot of the media coverage of the peace agreement, it relates to particular points or chapters of the agreement that have to do with more with the victim's point, with all the judgment of the part, but the special jurisdiction for peace, which of course it's very important and it generates a lot of emotions. But as saw in the research, people's priorities, at least in the most affected areas, have to do more with their well-being. So if you also have a more balanced information of how those measures are going, how the implementation of those measures are going, maybe you can get at least a more well-rounded notion of how the implementation process is going.
Thank you very much. We have another question that was submitted to us, and I would like Sally to please help us shed some light on it. What are your thoughts on measuring the level of local leadership in implementation of peace accords?
That's a great question. Thank you. With regards to the DDR program, I actually did measure the level of local leadership through a few variables, such as the institutional capacity of the municipalities and provinces in which these cantons are located, and also the political party that the mayors and the governors of these municipalities and departments or provinces belong to. And what I found out in the end in the statistical analysis that I did comparing these 24 cantons was that the level of local leadership did not matter for demobilization and reintegration of ex-combatants. So it wasn't like if in one municipality we had a really strong local leader that would help with the demobilization or reintegration. What I found out was important was the wartime commander that was present in the canton. Now remember, these are very strong men. They have really strong ties with the civilians from during the war, and they also have strong ties with politicians in the municipalities or the departments or the regions where they've engaged in rebel governance during the war. So when such strong leaders, such strong field commanders were present in the cantons, they could form alliances with the local politicians and get concessions to further benefit the economic projects that were ongoing in the camps. And where the commanders weren't present, when, for instance, they had been targeted by the Colombian military during the war and they had died, so they weren't present during the DDR process, then it didn't matter if there was a very strong local leader in place, because the conduit that was supposed to sort of form a link between that politician, that strong local leader, and the cantons and the ex-combatants was missing. And that conduit, that link, was the wartime commander. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, I mean, yes, I think so, but I will say the same as Latham said at the beginning. If that person feels that maybe we can expand more on it, he can or she can just send us an email. I have another question, and I would like to turn to Isabel. Which parts of the Colombian peace agreement are considered humanitarian special agreements under international humanitarian law?
Thank you, Josefina. Yeah, so to answer this question, I should first clear out that the comprehensive peace agreement in Colombia was signed as a special humanitarian agreement as a whole. So the agreement as a whole, as a package, is considered as a special humanitarian agreement. That basically means that both parties reinforced IHL duties and obligations that they already had before the international community. But particularly humanitarian stipulations in the Colombian peace agreements are related to compliance monitoring. So for instance, some dispositions that called for international accompaniment for prisoners release or security and personal guarantees from the United Nations, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and so on. There are other dispositions related to ceasefire, amnesty and prisoners release, disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, search for missing persons, protection of civilian population, and criminal prosecution of IHL breaches. I would add that generally IHL specific stipulations, this one that I have already listed out, yielded higher levels of implementation than the agreement as a whole. We see higher levels of implementation on those dispositions compared to those figures for the agreement as a whole. However, dispositions on civilian population and criminal prosecution of IHL's violations lag behind on implementation. And this is not particular to the Colombian case. Research conducted by Madhav and Jason, who are also joining this panel, shows that peace stipulations on criminal prosecution has proven to need longer lasting force for full implementation because they involve other tasks that need basically much more time to be fulfilled.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're almost at the end of our time. There are two questions that I still have here. One that I want to rethink a little bit, or reinterpret for our objective here. One is, at what point can a research be comparative? And another one about peace education. So what we're trying to do here is, so let me read the one about peace education. It says, my question is regarding the public policy and peace agreement misalignment or lack of integration of the agreements into the mainstream policy frameworks. Can we relate that with how the education and training of peace and conflict practitioners, as well as scholars, normally are not being part of the policy discussions is practiced? How can we reshape and redefine peace education, training, and practice of peace-building efforts to become part of the policy discussions and legal and justice frameworks? So I think that these two questions, even though they were sent separately by two different people, are really help us really focus back into what is the main objective of what we're doing here, not only at the Peace Accords Matrix, but overall at the Keough School for Global Affairs. And it's exactly that, and it's to have the ability to conduct comparative research, recognizing that every conflict is unique, and recognizing that everyone who is involved in conflict, especially if they have lasted overall for decades, and we're talking about even intergenerational trauma, etc., everyone perceives his or her own conflict dynamic as being relevant, pertinent, and unique, because it is a unique subjective experience. What we try to do in peace research is understand which can be beyond these particularities, what can be the common ground that allows us to look at different cases and understand certain patterns, not only in conflict parties that help us move forward and achieve agreements, so not only for negotiation and mediation, but also for the very design of the contracts or the peace agreements that are signed between the governments and the armed factions. So what we're trying to do is recognize the unique character of conflict and peace, as Maria Jose was saying when she was presenting her brief, asking people, what is peace for you? How do you perceive peace? How do you imagine it? How do you think it? How do you write it, etc.? And at the same time, learning from the experience of others. So what we have tried to do here is move forward in that direction, but doing it in a way that we are capable of understanding there are different types of knowledge that need to be integrated for sustainable peace building. That knowledge is not only academic research or scholarly research. That knowledge also has a lot to do with the perceptions of citizens on the ground, or not even citizens, let's say persons, because many of them do not really have the nationality, and that is, of course, part of the war. So of persons on the ground, that experiential knowledge is also extremely valuable for us when we want to move forward, not only in peace accord implementation, but also in sustainable peace building. And we also have the type of knowledge that we require to make accessible, but also to be able to be in a conversation, in a dialogue with those that are making decisions about public policy, those who are in the implementation agencies, the bureaucrats, but also the political leaders, the military leaders that have as their main task to take this peace agreement. Hopefully they have been part of it. Hopefully there has been some buy-in in the phases of negotiation, but definitely who are tasked with the responsibility of translating the commitments of the peace agreement into a public policy that really moves forward in the transformation of relationships that hopefully with time will help us decrease the legitimacy of violence for managing conflict, and increase not only the mechanisms, but also the legitimacy and the use of nonviolence for transforming conflicts. So this is a response that has more to do maybe with peace research, with peace studies, but I think it was a very nice way of ending this presentation and this seminar, because it kind of reminds us of why we are here and why we wanted to share these briefs with everyone. I thank all my team also at PAM that maybe are not presenting here, but that have been absolutely crucial and pivotal for creating the matrix, the database, those who have worked before in the early years, and those who have continued working with us over many years, Laurel Quinn, Patrick McQuestion, and of course, David Colwright that I saw was before. And all our team in Colombia, we have not only team leaders and researchers in Bogota, but we also have a great team in the territories. And last word of appreciation for everyone who has made this online or this virtual seminar possible, our communications team, our events manager, and of course, our PAM coordinator, Sofia Ravilac. So I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Don't forget, you can download all these first 6 briefs already from our website. And thank you to all presenters and to all speakers for their wonderful work and contributions today.